Unit 12. Listening Part 2. Exercise 3.
The Inuit, or Eskimo people, live in the Arctic and subarctic regions of Siberia, Greenland and Canada. Altogether, there are more than 100,000 Inuit, most of whom live near the sea, hunting aquatic mammals such as seals, walruses and whales. European whalers, who arrived in the latter part of the 19th century, had a great impact on the Inuit. They brought their religion, but they also brought their infectious diseases. Diseases to which the Inuit had no immunity, and which, as a direct consequence of this, reduced the population in some areas. In the past, the Inuit had several different forms of traditional housing. In Greenland, they often lived in permanent stone houses. Along the shores of Siberia, they lived in villages made up of wooden houses. Summer housing for many Inuit was a skin tent, while in the winter, igloos, houses made of snow, were common. Wherever they live today, the Inuit are involved in the modern world. They have wholeheartedly adopted much of its technology, as well as its clothing, and the design of their living spaces. Their economic, religious and governmental institutions have also been heavily influenced by the cultures of their near neighbours in Europe and America.
Unit 12. Listening Part 2. Exercise 4.
Today I'm going to be looking at some of the ways in which climate change is affecting the life and culture of the Inuit people. I suppose it would be true to say that, in today's world, most educated adults are aware of global warming and climate change. But how many of us living in modern cities with a seemingly inexhaustible supply of electricity into our homes and places of work, how many of us are actually affected by these phenomena in our daily lives? The Inuit, however, are being affected in a very real way on a daily basis by a frightening deterioration in their physical surroundings. They see melting ice sheets, changing tides, and notice the thinning of the polar bear population. They see how the daily weather markers on which they've relied for thousands of years are becoming less predictable as their fragile climate changes. In the past, if there was a ring around the moon, it meant a change of weather in the next few days. Now, such signs mean nothing. But these are just the most immediately visible indications of the changes taking place. Talk to the Inuit elders and hunters who depend on the land, and you'll hear disturbing accounts of deformed fish, diseased caribou, and baby seals left by their mothers to starve. In the last year or so, robins have appeared where robins have never been seen before. Interestingly, there's no word for robin in the Inuit language. These ideas are not simply based on what the Inuit themselves have observed. There's increasingly strong scientific evidence that the Arctic, this desert of snow, ice and killing cold wind, is thawing. Glaciers are receding, coastlines are receding, and other large bodies of fresh water are no longer there. Autumn freezes are coming later, and the winters are not as cold. For years, what the Inuit elders and hunters understood about the Arctic climate, known as traditional knowledge, was largely disregarded by the Western world. It was often dismissed as anecdotal and unreliable by scientists who visited the area with their recording devices and their theories. Some even view the Inuit as ignorant about a land which they've inhabited for thousands of years. But, more recently, scientists have begun paying attention to what the Inuit are reporting. According to geophysicist George Hobson, traditional Inuit knowledge was just waiting to be passed down. He says this deep understanding of the land and its wildlife have enabled the Inuit people to survive in the harsh Arctic environment. For thousands of years, the Inuit have lived by rules that require them to respect animals and the land. They've adapted to the cold climate as they hunted seals, walruses and whales. Silua Atagujuk, An elderly Inuit woman who lives in the city of Iqaluit doesn't want to pretend she knows more than anyone else. Nor does she try to blame anyone for the change in her environment. She's simply worried. Her world is not as it used to be, and her people may not have the capacity to adapt to it. She says that the Inuit have known all along that there'd be a time when the Earth would be destroyed, or would destroy itself. She believes that this process has begun.
Unit 12. Speaking, Part 3. Exercise 4.
Now, I'd like you to talk about something together for about 2 minutes. Here are some environmental threats that can affect people's lives. Talk to each other about how these threats can affect people's lives.
Well, this one's really relevant at the moment because it's in the news now, literally as we speak. There are lots of forest fires all over Australia and they're having a terrible effect on people's lives. The experts seem to think it's one of the results of climate change and global warming.
Yes, but forest fires only affect certain parts of the world, don't they? I mean, I'd say flooding is probably more widespread. It affects more different places, Asia, America and Europe. They say that's also connected with global warming, don't they?
Yes, and that's only going to get worse if the ice caps continue melting at the current rate. And flooding can cause terrible damage, at least as bad as fires.
And the opposite, drought, of course. In some ways, that's worse than floods because more people are affected. Droughts often lead to poor harvests, which means people have no food and have to travel for days, often on foot, to refugee camps where they're given food. But their lives can be ruined.
That used to be just in Africa, didn't it? I think it's now beginning to happen in parts of southern Europe. I remember a few years ago when all those people died in a heat wave in France.
I'm not sure that was quite like the situation in Africa, but drought and flooding are definitely more common than they used to be, and that's really worrying. And what about pollution as well, especially air pollution, which seems to be on the minds of many people at the moment? I'm sure that's going to affect us, perhaps more in the long term than now.
Do you think so? It already does affect us, doesn't it? I mean, think about how many more people there are now with allergies and breathing problems than there used to be.
Very true. And finally, there's fossil fuel consumption. Do you think that's really a threat?
Yes, I do. In 2 different ways. When we burn fossil fuels like coal and oil to make energy, that causes air pollution, doesn't it? And secondly, if the price of oil goes on rising, this will damage the world economy, and that will probably lead to all kinds of political tensions, perhaps even wars. Who knows?
Thank you.
Unit 12. Speaking, Part 3. Exercise 5.
Thank you. Now you have about a minute to decide which of the problems poses the greatest threat to us.
Which one of these 5 do we think is going to be the biggest threat?
It's very difficult to say, isn't it? They all pose terrible dangers, but perhaps the timescale is different.
What do you mean?
Well, they all affect us now, but in the future, some will get worse and some will improve.
Do you think so?
Yes, I do. For example, in the short term, I think fossil fuel consumption poses the greatest threat because it affects us now. But eventually, we'll run out of fossil fuels, which means that in the future, we won't be able to consume them. By that time, of course, the other threats like air pollution, fires, flooding and droughts will be worse because of increases in global warming.
You could be right. So, what are we going to decide? Personally, I think drought is going to pose the greatest threat, especially if the population of the world goes on growing.
Yes, I think I agree. If harvests fail, millions of people can starve to death, whereas at least in the case of forest fires and flooding, people usually escape, even though their lives may be changed forever.
Okay, let's say we think that drought poses the greatest long-term threat.